Hello everyone, welcome to the event. My name is Lata Varadarajan and I'm a professor in the Political Science Department and the director for the Program on International Security and Conflict Resolution, one of the co-sponsors of this event. Our program is one that attempts to engage with questions of conflict and cooperation from an interdisciplinary perspective, and I would say that the need for that is greater than ever before today. We live in turbulent times. This is a world in which elected leaders of putative liberal democracies can apparently cheerfully declare open season on land grabs, ethnic cleansing, and mass murder, though they're of course euphemistically described in terms of real estate deals, voluntary population transfers, and self-defense. This is a world in which the specters of the past, far from being put to rest, have come back, fully embodied. History has indeed returned with a vengeance. And so, in a world like this, it is more important than ever for us to have a space where it is still possible to have civil discourse, especially on issues that draw such passionate responses, and a discourse that's premised on a fundamental openness to challenging, difficult, and ideas that are in opposition to what passes for the mainstream. And it is also important for us to have people who have the willingness and the ability to put themselves forward to facilitate such discussions. It is my very great pleasure, and indeed a privilege, to officially introduce you to our panelists today, who each in their own way embody this willingness to connect intellectual and political pursuits in ways that challenge us to go beyond the received common sense of the day. Peter Beinart, our guest of honor, is a professor of journalism and political science at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. He is also the editor-at-large for Jewish Currents, publisher of the Beinart Notebook, a frequent contributor to the New York Times, and an MSNBC analyst. Welcome, Peter, and thank you for joining us this evening. Instead of just having a talk, our decision was to have a conversation between Peter and two interlocutors. And we are very, very lucky to have among our SDSU faculty two people who I think are uniquely fitted for this task. Professor Manal Swairjo is a professor of biochemistry at SDSU. Her research focuses on RNA biogenesis processes and their links to human disease. You can, from my very speaking of these words, you know how far away it is from my own work. So forgive me if it sounds strange. She was born in Gaza, Palestine, and much of her family in Gaza has been killed by Israel's destructive assault. In San Diego, she co-founded a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue in 2000 after the collapse of Oslo and the outbreak of the Second Intifada. Thank you, Dr. Swairjo, for taking time to be with us here today. Our other discussant today is someone whom I've had the privilege of calling colleague and friend for nearly 2 decades now, so you will forgive me if I presume on my familiarity to say that Professor Jonathan Graubart is well known for his stubbornness. And there are many here in this audience who know him and who might recognize him in my description. But here I want to remark on his stubbornness, particularly in regard to two things: his commitment to respecting his Jewish heritage and his commitment to ensuring that there is space in our university to have open conversation about the prospects of peace, not just in the Middle East, but in global politics, and to do so in ways where dissenting voices remain heard. So, welcome, Jonathan, and thank you for taking the leading role in organizing this event, because it would not have been possible without him. Insofar as his professional credentials, Jonathan was my predecessor as director of ISCOR. He currently serves as the chair of the Political Science Department. He's also the author of Jewish Self-Determination Beyond Zionism, Lessons from Hannah Arendt and Other Pariahs, which was published by Temple University Press 2 years ago. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I would strongly recommend it. He's also the co-founder of Hinenu Havara, a progressive Jewish collective in San Diego. An event of this sort is, of course, not possible without institutional support. I'd like to thank our partners in SDSU, the Department of Political Science, Jewish Studies, the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies, across the highways, our partners at UCSD, the Department of Communication, the Center for the Study of Religion and Middle East Studies, as well as our community partners, Hinenu Havara, and the San Diego chapter of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, the ADC. I would now like to invite Doris Bitar and Jim Rausch of the ADC to the stage to tell us a little bit more about this event. Doris and Jim, let's get to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Jonathan, for making this happen. And thank goodness SDSU has President's Day at work and not off, because we were trying to put this into, bringing Peter in, and he's on his way to Los Angeles tomorrow and then the Bay Area after that. So we're very lucky to have brought him in. So I'm a West Coast coordinator for the ADC. And I'll be very, very brief. I'm just very appreciative that this all happened and that Peter was able to be so generous to swing by San Diego. And we have him be very busy the last 24 hours or more. And I just want to say that aside from everything else here, you might, I'm not sure what he's going to say, and I don't want to forecast that. But Peter's also a storyteller. And he knows how to, he's a religious Jew, and he knows how to weave in biblical stories. And if you don't hear those tonight, which you probably won't, but you can definitely hear it in the Jewish Currents, his weekly Zooms that he has, where he has guests, and other sorts of things, especially around Jewish holidays. And that's really all I have to say. I just want to thank Jonathan so much for everything that you've helped manage and put together here. And my husband, Jim, I'm Lebanese Palestinian, he's Jewish, in case you didn't know that. We went to high school together. I didn't think of him as a Jew. I don't think he thought of me as an Arab. We just journeyed together and learned a lot as we became adults. And that's really all I have to say. It's possible to have conversation. Be wary of things that shut conversation. I'll give it to Jim.
I just wanted to say it's such an honor to be able to introduce Peter here tonight. He's kind of the closest thing we have to a rock star among Jewish commenters. I attended my niece's wedding last September and got into a screaming argument with my brother-in-law, who was president of his synagogue in Philadelphia suburb. And if Peter's book had been around at that time, I could have saved myself a lot of trouble at this nice event and just said, just refer to page 53. And as an economist who's a professional skeptic, I really couldn't give higher praise, because we never want to appeal to authority. We want to go all the way through the data on ourselves, but I think Peter's book is so compelling that we really can just refer people to it and save ourselves a lot of trouble at family events. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Peter and Jonathan and Manal.
Okay, I get to start the event, the substantive part. So welcome all. I do want to give a particular thanks to Doris and Jim that really initiated this. So, and I am grateful that San Diego State is open on President's Day. Otherwise, it would have gone to UC San Diego. So, I want to give a plug for two events, since I have a nice audience here, is one, myself and other Jewish colleagues at San Diego State are working to develop just an alternative group of Jewish students, staff, and faculty who are uncomfortable with kind of the mainstream Jewish establishment perspective. And so for those who might be interested, feel free to come up to me afterwards if you want to just be part of our group. The second plug is for an event I'm co-organizing on March 5th. We're screening this documentary called The Palestine Exception. We'll have a film director, one of the film directors there. That will be at Hardy Tower, 140 at 6:30 on March 5th. Okay, so now on to kind of the Jewish section of the program. I do come from a long line of rabbis. My brother is a 7th generation rabbi. But I think one reason I didn't become a rabbi is I like to have notes. Rabbis generally don't have notes, when they give sermons and present. So that's the trick of the preachers. I don't do the parlor trick, so I have notes. So forgive me if I read through my notes. But so I'm going to get things started as someone both deeply attached to the Jewish community and appalled at what Israel has become and at the complicity of the American Jewish establishment. I am especially grateful, like Jim Rouse is, for Peter Beinart. As we'll discuss soon, Peter was not always a kindred spirit. He held very different views and expressed them eloquently. But when Peter came over fully to the critical Jewish perspective, I and so many other long-time dissenting Jews were thrilled. Now, this brilliant, articulate, and compassionate, decent person, what we would call a true mensch, had joined our side. So now I knew we can't lose. So the book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, is fascinating. And while the primary audience may be Jews, the book resonates with anyone concerned about Palestine and Israel, and with all those that say struggling over tensions within their own communities. Here's a posting someone passed on to me from an Anglican chaplain to her congregation recommending the book. This is what she wrote. If you want to feel a surge of hope about what could be possible in Palestine and Israel, I highly recommend this book. It is incredibly powerful. I acknowledge that I feel conflicted in sharing this because the subject matter feels like a very intra-Jewish conversation. That said, as someone involved in interfaith work, I felt some version of what the author experiences within his own community. I have lost Jewish friends over the past 18 months. I have had other relationships deeply strained, and I have been called anti-Semite more times than I can count. If there is a solid reason for Goyim to pick up this book, that means Gentiles, it is to hear Beinart's compassionate explanation of what October 7th meant to the global community at an existential level. He also explores the emotional dynamics of Zionism and offers a call for compassion and understanding, especially for enthusiastic progressives on college campuses, about where that line of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism lies. So I'll start, for the benefit of those who haven't yet read the book, by giving the audience a flavor of his new book. I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning and a little bit from the end. Okay. So starting at the prologue entitled, "We Need a New Story." The Talmud poses a question. If you steal, a note to my former friend. This really gets to the point. I think about you often and about the argument that has divided us. I know you believe that my public opposition to this war and to the very idea of a state that favors Jews over Palestinians constitutes a betrayal of our people. I know you think I am putting your family at risk. The breach in our relationship mirrors a broader schism within our tribe, between Americans and Israelis, left and right, young and old. When I enter a synagogue, I am no longer sure who will extend their hand and who will look away. Maybe you feel a similar anxiety in progressive circles, where you once felt at home. Jews have always quarreled, and we should. But I worry that given the trajectory of events in Israel and Palestine, we may be moving past mere disagreement toward hatred. Moving a few pages forward, this book is about the story Jews tell ourselves to block out the screams. It's about the story that enables our leaders, our families, and our friends to watch the destruction of the Gaza Strip, the flattening of universities, the people forced to make bread from hay, the children freezing to death under buildings turned to rubble by a state that speaks in our name and shrug, if not applaud. It's about the story that convinces even Jews who are genuinely pained by Gaza's agony that there is no other way to keep us safe. It's our version of a story told in many variations by many peoples in many places who decide that protecting themselves requires subjugating others. That equality is tantamount to death. My hope is that we will one day see Gaza's obliteration as a turning point in Jewish history. From the destruction of the Second Temple to the expulsion from Spain to the Holocaust, Jews have told new stories to answer the horrors we endured. We must tell now a new story to answer the horror that a Jewish country has perpetrated with the support of many Jews around the world. Its central element should be this: we are not history's permanent virtuous victims. We are not hardwired to forever endure evil but never commit it. That false innocence which pervades contemporary Jewish life camouflages domination and self-defense. It exempts Jews from external judgment. It offers infinite license to fallible human beings. And the final paragraph. This book is for the Jews who are still sitting at that Shabbat table, and for the Jews, sometimes their own children, who have left in disgust. I yearn for us to sit together, but not this way, not as masters of the house. And then I want to get just to the end of the book. Maybe this sounds grandiose, but I don't think our transformation as Jews is necessary only for Israel and Palestine. It's necessary for the world. Scrolling down. Speaking of Abraham's descendants in the book of Genesis, God says, "All the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you." Perhaps this is what it means for the Jewish people to bless humanity in our time. It means liberating ourselves from supremacy, so as partners with Palestinians, we can help liberate the world. So I certainly urge all of you to get your copy of the book. Okay. Now on to my questions. So my first question tweaks your opening chapter, a note to my former friend, and asks you to give a note from your former self, from the young Peter Beinart. Peter is indicative of that rare breed who keeps thinking deeply, who listens deeply to others. You've been a public intellectual who has shifted your views markedly on U.S. foreign policy and on Israel Zionism. In the 1990s and the first half of the 2000s, where some of us regarded you as not on our side, you edited the then liberal, hawkish, and pro-Israel New Republic. You supported the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and you wrote a book called The Good Fight: Why Liberals and Only Liberals Can Win the War on Terror and Make America Great Again. Okay, so you were clearly a liberal hawk. I don't think it was meant as praise for Trump. Okay, but by the 2010s, you had become more critical of U.S. military intervention, and you became a sharp liberal critic of Israel's occupations and the failings of the American Jewish establishment. Yet, in your book, Crisis of Zionism, which came out in 2012, and in our prior conversation, we met previously in 2016 at San Diego State, you still supported a Jewish nation state as a necessary refuge, and you disagreed with my call to resurrect a pre-1948 dissenting Zionist program of a single binational state that integrated Jewish and Arab autonomy in a united federation. Yet, as you're still thinking and listening, by 2020, if not sooner, you made a much bigger break. And by now, you now oppose the idea of a Jewish nation state for various reasons. Your new book demands a Jewish reckoning of where Zionism and Jewish values went wrong, and you sketch out a new path for the Jewish people, which includes an egalitarian binational system in Israel-Palestine of a just coexistence. So my take on your overall shift is this: The younger, I guess I'm playing therapist here, but the younger Peter Beinart believed in the overall goodness of both America's post-World War II global engagement and the Zionist project, while acknowledging shortcomings in practice, such as the US war in Vietnam and Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Your hope seemingly was to recover the supposedly decent liberal foundations of the US and of Israel. You also distanced yourself from anti-imperialist in general and anti-Zionist in particular. So now back to the question of a note to my former self. What would Peter Beinart in 2025 say to the Peter Beinart of the 1990s and early 2000s? Could you come up with words to set the young Peter straight? Are there still some shared beliefs?
Thanks. I mean, before I address that, let me just say that when I think about speaking on this topic, I'm always hoping that there are people in the audience, either in the room or virtually, who disagree with me. And I think it's always, I feel like it's really important for me that this book was not written to people who necessarily agree with me. It was written to people who I love who disagree. And if you're one of those people who disagrees passionately with my point of view, but still came to hear me, I really deeply admire people who go out of their way to hear points of view different than theirs, which is something that doesn't happen nearly enough in the Jewish community and in the United States as well. And one of my favorite lines from Jewish texts is from Pirkei Avot in the Mishnah, which says, "Who is wise? The one who learns from all people." So I feel like if you're the person who's ideologically the furthest from me in the room, or listening virtually, you're the person who in some ways is exhibiting the greatest wisdom because you're going the furthest distance to learn. So thank you. In terms of my evolution, I think that I've always been influenced and by writers and intellectuals whose views changed over time in response to events. So my second book, The Icarus Syndrome, is really about a series of American intellectuals, Reinhold Niebuhr, Walter Lippmann in particular, and others, whose views changed a lot in response to different world events. And so I think for me, part of the following the stories of those people has kind of, for me, a lesson that it's actually not necessarily pure consistency over the course of an entire lifetime isn't necessarily possible, because one is surprised by events and that one should be open to reconsidering them. In terms of my own reconsiderations, I think I was very much a child of the 1990s in terms of my political awareness, the late 1980s and the early 1990s, and I think about the formative experiences for me. So those formative experiences were the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, America's, certain things that are now not remembered as well, America's military success, apparently successful military intervention in Panama, the Gulf War, and then particularly America's military interventions in Bosnia in 1995 and in Kosovo in 1999. And the third wave, the spread of the kind of third wave of democracy that took place around the world in the 1980s and in the 1980s into the 1990s. And I think that produced in me, this is actually what my second book, The Icarus Syndrome, is really all about. I think what I could only in retrospect see was as a kind of a hubris about both American military power and about the power of what I thought of as the American model. As I saw the spread of democracy in Eastern Europe and in much of the developing world. And I think that I did not reckon nearly enough with events that had happened to earlier generations of Americans, in particular the Vietnam War. In a strange way, the time period that I grew up in was a time period in which older people kept saying that every American military conflict would be Vietnam. So I remember people saying that Panama would be Vietnam, and the Gulf War would be Vietnam, and Bosnia would be Vietnam. And none of those were Vietnam. And in fact, especially with Bosnia, which was really a kind of, in the former Yugoslavia, which was a big issue at the New Republic, and Rwanda, where we felt that the United States should have intervened, there was a sense, in fact, that actually America's failures might have been not intervening enough as we watched these ethnic cleansings and genocides taking place. So I think it was that current, and I think when we look back at the 1990s, I think it was an era of mounting American hubris in general, a kind of a unipolar world. The Soviet Union had collapsed. America's thought was a sense that America's capitalist model was a model for the world, right? And I think that when I think back to it, I think I lacked the historical perspective and perhaps humility to have learned from a wider cross-section of American events to realize that my particular interpretation on this particular slice of history that I had experienced actually concealed a lot of very important lessons about the limits of American power, the limits of American virtue, the limits of American wisdom. And those things were brought forth to me in a really very, very dramatic way and a painful way when I was one of those people who supported the Iraq War, and then, it clearly pretty soon became clear it was a calamity for the country, for the Middle East, for Iraq. My own sister-in-law was deployed both to Iraq and Afghanistan, so I had to kind of have some pretty uncomfortable conversations in my own extended family about why it was that she had to leave her 2-year-old and then her 2-year-old and her 4-year-old for these military adventures. Then Michael Kelly, my former boss and mentor at the New Republic, was killed in the Iraq War. So these were all things that led me to realize that I had to reconsider pretty fundamentally if I was going to continue to write about America's role in the world, because my entire framework had basically collapsed. It was clearly not a good framework for understanding world events and America's role in them. So that's on the Israel side. Sorry if this answer is a little long. I think on the Israel side, partly I was also a child of the kind of two-state paradigm that was born when the PLO, in a historic shift, embraced partition in 1988, and then the Oslo process in 1993. There were people like Edward Said, for instance, who said from the very beginning that Said supported two states at that point. I mean, he was involved in the decision in '88 to embrace partition. He only became a one-stater near the end of his life, so even he shifted his views. But he saw, in a way that I certainly didn't, that Oslo was not going to lead to a Palestinian state, but in fact it was what he called a Palestinian Versailles. But I remain very much within that paradigm, and I think for a variety of reasons. First of all, to some degree, since the Palestinian national movement itself had accepted the idea of partition, it seemed to me, it seemed to me that was kind of a sufficiently pro-Palestinian position to take, since it was the position of the PLO. I also think that at that point, and it was only as I watched the two-state solution become less and less and less viable that I began to be open to the idea of reconsidering the entire notion of Jewish statehood, because partition seemed to me to kind of save the project of Jewish statehood by allowing Israel not to have to control all these Palestinians who didn't have citizenship. And I think that I also, it was very difficult for me to imagine at that point Jewish safety and Jewish kind of cultural survival in Israel-Palestine without the project of statehood. And it was really only, I think, over quite a long period of time, particularly reading Palestinian writing, which I had not read enough of, I think, by the time, certainly in the 1990s, that I think I began to read more and more people who were thinking outside of that paradigm, and I began to see that, and to reconnect more with the kind of Jewish intellectual tradition you're talking about, of people like Buber and Judah Magnus and others who themselves thought of a binational state rather than a Jewish state.
Okay, so I have 3 questions. So question number 2, and these will be shorter, is it's kind of an academic question. I think both you and I are receptive to the idea of cultural Zionism as opposed to political Zionism, meaning a Jewish nation state. Yet, it seems my question is about the failings in practice of cultural Zionism and your hope for a Jewish transformation that overcomes an internal victimhood syndrome and retrieves the best of, I think, Jewish religious and secular traditions. So once upon a time, there were many cultural Zionists like the Hadam, Martin Buber, Hannah Arendt's my favorite, who hoped establishing a Jewish homeland as opposed to a nation state in the ancient land of Israel. would spark the spiritual and moral uplifting of Jews worldwide. Now many of us Jewish dissenters see Israel as at least a net albatross. It's bringing out the worst qualities of the Jewish people. And then, with that in mind, would you then see the primary focus of the Jewish Renaissance you and I hope for with the large American Jewish diaspora? So unlike in Israel, the bulk of American Jews, as you well know, hold liberal pluralist values. So this is not true in Israel. While many young American Jews, as we know, are joining protests of Israel's policies and questioning fundamental tenets of Zionism. So to turn the cultural Zionism on its head, rather than Israel being essential for a decent and vibrant Jewish community worldwide, has the diaspora, especially in the United States, become the essential battle point to undo the damage of the actually existing Zionist project?
Well, I do think America, as the largest diaspora Jewish community and the most powerful one because it's in the most powerful country, is the place where the inter-Jewish struggle over the relationship with Israel is being played out in the most significant way. And I do think that part of the reason I wrote this book is that I think that American Jews have an important role to play in a larger struggle for Palestinian liberation. It's not going to be, nor should it be, a Jewish-led movement, but I think it has to be one of these great movements, like we've seen in certain moments in world and American history, that brings together people of all different backgrounds. But I think in part because the role of accusations of anti-Semitism and the role of the organized American Jewish community is so central in limiting the growth of that movement, that Jews have to be part of it if there's going to be a chance of kind of overcoming that. And I also think it's really important. I think the great moral movements, I think about the civil rights movement or the anti-apartheid movement, managed to find, at least in some of their moments, I think a language of mutual liberation, in which I think one of the things that people like King and Mandela were able to vocalize was the idea that they were trying to also liberate people from being oppressors. And I think Jews have a particular role to play in that as well, in being able to speak about this as a movement of Jewish liberation as well as Palestinian liberation. Obviously, Jewish liberation is a completely different kind of way than Palestinian liberation, just like what it meant to be liberated from segregation was completely different if you were a white Southerner as opposed to a black Southerner, but that there is something very important in that notion, which I try to write about in the book, of being liberated from being an oppressor. Because I think it does, this is again something that King really thought about a lot, it really does warp you in a lot of ways, and one of the things the book tries to write about is the way in which Jewish life in the United States and beyond is kind of warped in so many ways and impoverished by this effort to have to defend this project of supremacy and oppression. And so, as you see people who in so many other facets of their lives, and even in other facets of their political lives, express and support principles of compassion and equality and liberal democracy, and then a kind of a wall goes up on this issue, and also support open intellectual inquiry, right? I mean, it's amazing to me how many Jewish writers, pro-Israel Jewish writers, there are who a few years ago were writing, sometimes quite eloquently, about the need for fearless and open debate on university campuses, arguing that we should not have snowflakes and safe spaces, that people should be made uncomfortable, that free speech was the highest of all virtues, right? And yet, when those principles were put to the test over the last 15 months on this issue, in fact, they were nowhere to be found, or worse, right? They ended up, it's actually that from that same political corner, we now have the most ferocious assault on freedom of speech and academic freedom, I think, perhaps in my lifetime. On the question of cultural Zionism, the reason that I think that like you, that the cultural Zionist tradition is important for American Jews to be aware of, Jews in general to be aware of, which I think many are not. For most people, to support Zionism means to support a Jewish state. It's pretty simple, right? But I think the reason it's important to remember that there were very important figures, like going back to Achad Ha'am and then Martin Buber and Magnus and others, Arendt, who distinguish between Jewish culture in Israel and Palestine and a Jewish state, is that today the dominant assumption in a Jewish discourse is that if there is no Jewish state, if there's not a Jewish supremacist political system, then there essentially are no Jews. That they are either killed or subjugated, or at the very least they can't flourish, right? And so I think and I disagree with that. I actually genuinely believe that the future of the future of Israeli Jews is much safer and more vibrant under conditions of legal equality than under conditions of legal supremacy, because conditions of legal supremacy involve the infliction of a tremendous amount of structural violence on people who are treated as legal inferiors, and that system of structural violence ultimately, I think, endangers everybody. And so for me, this tradition is important because it allows us to detangle these things and say, no, there is a tradition of us being able to imagine people speaking in Hebrew, writing in Hebrew, producing art in Hebrew in this place without a state that gives Jews rights over Palestinians.
Okay, I'm going to selfishly ask you for insights on my current project, as hopefully of interest to the audience too. Can you give advice on the growing segment of dissenting American Jews on how to address this dual challenge that comes with combating anti-Semitism? I mean, like Jews across the spectrum, we too are worried about a surge in genuine anti-Semitism in the United States. It's mostly in the form of the growth of reactionary nationalism, the type that vote for Trump, and white supremacy. But it's true also to a lesser extent in various non-white communities and on the fringes of Palestine solidarity movement. So anti-Semitism is definitely going up, and something that dissenting Jews also worry about. The problem that us dissenting Jews face is on the other side. It's a dogmatic American Jewish establishment who sees critics of Zionism and Israeli brutalities as the enemy, worse perhaps even than Elon Musk or white supremacists, and it includes their contempt for Jewish opponents of Israeli policies like Jewish Voice for Peace. So the Jewish establishment, led by the Anti-Defamation League, engages in blatant manipulation of the charge of anti-Semitism to discredit virtually all defenders of Palestinians. So frustratingly for us dissenting American Jews who really are concerned and would like to see a good response to anti-Semitism, the ADL and like-minded groups have the ears of most politicians, Democrats and Republicans, and leaders of colleges and universities, including my own. So the result is, rather than getting sensible policies that combat genuine anti-Semitism and feature solidarity with other discriminated groups, we get Israel advocacy laundered as anti-Semitism that simply enables Israel's destructive policies. So with that as a setup, what do you advise for us dissenting Jews to do about what is a serious problem of anti-Semitism?
Anti-Semitism on the right and the left.
Yeah, in the U.S., yeah.
So I think the first thing is to recognize that these are not equidistant threats. That the kind of main Jewish establishment line is that Jews are equally menaced from the right and the left, although in reality they actually don't even act as if they're equidistant. They actually act as if left-wing anti-Semitism is a bigger threat, right? So you see that Elon Musk is treated much more gingerly by the Anti-Defamation League when he, the guy man has never met basically a neo-Nazi he doesn't like, and yet he is actually he's treated with much more gingerly than Rashida Tlaib if she says Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, right? So, but I think the first thing is to say that The actual data we have does not suggest that anti-Semitism is equal on the right and the left. In some ways, any more than anti-black racism is, or transphobia or homophobia or misogyny is equal on the left, right and the left. I mean, these bigotries do exist across the ideological spectrum, but there is something about the political right which means that they tend to be much higher, right? And it's not coincidental, right? People on the right tend to have an idealized view of some prior moment in American or world history in which the hierarchies were clearer. The hierarchies were clearer between men and women, straight and gay, Jews and Gentiles, black and white, whatever, right? That's kind of what Trump is talking about when he talks about Make America Great Again. It's like some moment, 1953, 1983, kind of when we knew who was on top and who was on bottom, right? And so what you find is that there's something about being on the right that makes you more sympathetic towards these hierarchies that express themselves between different groups. And that what the poll, and if you look, you can't look at the Anti-Defamation League's data, it's tragic that this is the organization that's collecting data because the data is disastrous, right? Because its definition of anti-Semitism is taking in anybody, so much anti-Zionist discourse, right? But if you look at like people who study this as academics, and I cite the work of this guy Eitan Hirsch at Tufts and Laura Roden. By the way, Eitan Hirsch is not a leftist in his own politics, but what he finds is that it's far, far higher on the right, and the study's also shown to show that these bigotries tend to travel together. So the Americans who have the highest kind of negative views about Jews also have very negative views about Muslims and negative views about immigrants and negative views about black people, right? They have a certain view of America, right? And so I think that's the first thing to kind of recognize, right? And I think this would be obvious if the fight against anti-Semitism had not become so deeply entangled with the defense of a particular state, right? So I sometimes try to imagine what would the NAACP look like if it defined as central to its mission the defense of various African states, right? So anyone who criticized human rights abuses in Nigeria or Kenya was then considered an anti-black racist. I bet they would find a lot more anti-black racism on the left, right? Because they would find people who were concerned about human rights who were criticizing these countries, right? And if you just said if you judged Islamophobia by who's most critical of Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, you would find more Islamophobia on the left because a human rights-oriented person is going to be more critical of these authoritarian states, right? So that's the problem with this, I think, this conversation. And so I think the way to fight anti-Semitism on the right, which is the most serious form of anti-Semitism, has to be in conjunction with other groups that face these bigotries as part of a kind of, as an alliance, right? To try to, based on the principle of equality under the law, irrespective of race, religion, sex, gender, sexual orientation. But you can't do that coherently if you're simultaneously defending a system of supremacy in Israel-Palestine, right? This is the kind of deep moral contradiction at the heart of these organizations, right? So when it comes to the question of anti-Semitism on the left, which does exist. I mean, you can just go back to the Soviet Union after the Soviet Union statements after it broke with Israel after the Six-Day War. You see the Soviet Union did use the word Zionist at times in ways that were clearly code for Jew. Basically, every time people rose up, when people were rising up in Poland or Czechoslovakia against Soviet domination, the Soviets were always saying it was the Zionists behind it. I think there I would say three things. I think the first thing is anti-Jewish kind of ideas, stereotypes, kind of ways of thinking are deeply rooted in Western culture. So they serve as a kind of what the political scientist David Feldman calls a kind of reservoir. So it's worth just remembering that when you talk about things that have to do with Jewish power, that there is a long history of talking about Jews as kind of shadowy, malevolent figures. That's not to say you shouldn't talk about AIPAC's power in Congress, or you should never talk about the way the media covers. Of course you should have talk about these things. These things are very important subjects. But you should just do so with the awareness that you try to be careful and precise in what you talk about. It's one thing to say, AIPAC wields vastly disproportionate power and they're spending their money in this way, right? That rather than saying the Zionists do it, let alone the Jews do it, right? I think precision is really helpful here, and it's worth remembering that that all of us, just like many of us can be involved in anti-black racism without thinking about the history of these stereotypes, that the same could be true for anti-Semitism. The second thing I would say is, One line from Naomi Klein that I really like is she says, "Be tough on systems but soft on people." By which I mean, I think I think people should by all means have this most strenuous criticisms of a system of Jewish supremacy and its domination of Palestinians and oppression of Palestinians. But I think that when you're dealing with, let's say, a Jewish college student who comes to campus, coming from a home and a community in which they have been raised, and in which their own family story has been deeply interwoven with the idea that a Jewish state is what keeps them safe, right? Going up to that person and saying something essentially like, "You settler colonialist asshole," right, is not a productive way of interacting, right? Like, I think you can have empathy for people if you and a curiosity about the family stories that have led them to a place, even if you profoundly disagree with them, right? And that's the way I would hope we would respond, let's say, to South Asian kids who come from families whose parents think Narendra Modi is the greatest thing since sliced bread, right? That you actually engage with these kids and have a conversation with them and challenge their ideas, right? And try to, and you can make them intellectually uncomfortable, but I think the dialogue is worth having. And the third point is that you have to distinguish between Israel as a state and Jews as a group of people, right? And the problem with that is that the organized Jewish community, on the one hand, is demanding that people who don't like Israel or Zionism make that distinction. On the other hand, the organized American Jewish community doesn't make that distinction itself, right? And that's a very, very big problem, right? So, and it's something that worries me a tremendous amount, because there is data which shows that when Israel kills more Palestinians, there is a spike in reported anti-Semitic incidents. So there are some people who are conflating these two things, right? And so everyone has to work, it seems to me, everyone has to have the project of keeping these things two separate. If you're Jewish and you want to support Israel, that's a choice you can make. You can be a Christian person who wants to support Israel, right? But to say it's inherent in being Jewish actually puts Jewish people at risk. Right? I mean, can you imagine how dangerous it would be for Chinese Americans if Chinese American organizations were saying to be Chinese American means that you support the People's Republic of China? That would be an extremely dangerous thing for Chinese Americans if their leadership was doing that. But the organized American Jewish leadership essentially is saying, they say it very explicitly, that to be Jewish is to be a Zionist, which is, first of all, as you know, a kind of an absurd statement, because Zionism is very recent in Jewish history, and there have always been Jewish critics of Zionism and the State of Israel. But I think that we have to fight to try to keep these two things separate, because if they're not separate, among other things, it actually puts Jews at greater risk.
Okay, thank you. I turn the questions over to Manal.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Peter. You kind of covered a lot of grounds on all the questions I have, and I'm supposed to have 3 questions. Mine are short and direct, like science type questions. So, you mentioned you said a colonialist asshole statement. Because it was just in my mind when you said it, I'm like, we're going there. So in the same token, the Zionism is racism.
Yeah.
Okay, we talked about it yesterday a little bit. So, you are of the view that what is happening in Israel is a Jewish superiority system.
Yeah.
Okay, but I haven't heard you invoke the word racism.
Right.
So, how do you? Of course, Palestinians. The way they experience the system in Israel is a system of racial and ethnic hierarchies, right? Which is, in practice, has the structures of racism, right? Or what they call a system of structural racism. I mean, I'm not saying that's the truth, right? But that is what is described by Palestinians as to how they receive their experience. So basically, what are your thoughts about this? In other words, basically, it took me a while to formulate this question. How do you engage with the argument that Zionism, as it has been implemented, carries structural racism?
So I definitely believe that it carries structural bigotry. right? I think it's a form of legalized supremacy. My only reason I don't use the racism is the complication of whether these are races or not. Now, some people will use the term racism in a broader way, right? Even as essentially a synonym for bigotry, right? So even if it's bigotry against a religious group or an ethnic group, and of course race is a fiction anyway, right? So in some ways the whole thing is kind of silly, right? But I think the reason I don't use the word racism, but I use the word bigotry, is only I don't want to get caught up in a cul-de-sac of someone saying, well, but Jews aren't a race, right? But I think that this is and I like the term Jewish supremacy because I think that in fact, you can see in Israel there are racial differences among Jews, right? If you're a black Israeli whose family came from Ethiopia, you will be discriminated against within Israeli Jewish society, but you will also have superior legal rights to Palestinians because you're Jewish, and that's the critical criteria, right? And this is a system of legalized supremacy and institutionalized bigotry of Jews over Palestinians.
Thank you. So, my other question also direct. So over the last 30 years, I have co-founded several dialogue groups here in San Diego and on the East Coast. And these conversations are often fraught as Jewish participants struggle to challenge Zionist narratives. Of course, the ones they've grown up with, while Palestinians are asked to always explain themselves or make their suffering understandable, So, given your own journey in shifting perspectives, what advice do you have for facilitating these difficult but necessary dialogues in a way that truly shifts consciousness?
Wow, that's a really good question. I can imagine that being in a conversation where you're having to argue for your rights to equality with someone would be a kind of conversation that many people would not want to be engaged in. That the conversation itself may seem insulting and even dehumanizing to have to argue for something that you should have the minute you walk into the room before you even open your mouth, right? Just by virtue of being a fellow human being. So, and I think, you see that's why oftentimes with black Americans, they're not necessarily so interested in kind of black-white discussion groups, right? Because they don't want to have to basically, and so I think I totally respect that there may be many Palestinians who don't want to be involved in that effort, right? And others who might say, these efforts don't lead anywhere, right? And I agree that they don't lead anywhere on their own, right? Which is to say, I don't think any group of people who have legalized supremacy that I know of give that legalized supremacy up without pressure, right? I mean, Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand, right? Systems of supremacy only end when people who are benefiting from that supremacy start to realize that the system cannot continue, that somehow things are interfering with the system so much that they have to think about alternatives. It's not like usually they wake up one morning and think, oh, this is just really terrible, let's get rid of it, right? They have to go to plan B because plan A is no longer working for them even well enough. And that's usually because there's resistance to it that's starting to muck things up. So you need absolutely that kind of pressure. But I also think that I have just seen in my own life the way in which interactions with Palestinians have changed the perceptions and experiences and actions of Jews. And I think that happens in America in a way that it tends not to happen in Israel because there is some greater degree of relative equality here that allows a human interaction that's certainly impossible in a place like the West Bank, and even in Israel proper is extremely difficult. And I think that, unfortunately, sometimes these changes, perhaps including my own, are painfully slow. But I also think that they can kind of gather steam over time in a kind of snowball effect. Certainly that with younger people, you notice that the transformations of people's ideas can come much more quickly because people don't have decades and decades of being ingrained, and they're also not involved in entire communities and even jobs that require them to have a certain view. The social cost of changing your mind if you're 19 is much less than if you're 49 or 69, and that's part of the reason that we see the polling shows a huge generational gap among American Jews. And I think one of the reasons for that is interactions with Palestinians. I think it's partly that Palestinians are more visible on social media, and I also think it's something that happens on college campuses. I mean, you would think that listening to the ADL or whatever, that the only kind of interaction between Palestinians and Jews on college campuses is Palestinians, chasing after Jews, screaming at them. But in fact, I think that there's a lot of just human interaction where people meet one another and they hear stories that they were never exposed to, and it changes them, and sometimes it can happen quickly. And I think the snowball effect happens because I know from personal experience that there is a gap between the public Jewish discourse about Israel and the private Jewish discourse about Israel. There are people who are passionately, even in their private, deeply passionate supporters of unconditional support for Israel. But there's another group of people who actually harbor doubts, sometimes quite significant doubts, but they won't vocalize them because of the fear of the social opprobrium or the fear of losing their jobs. And I think there are a lot of non-Orthodox rabbis who fall into that category, a lot. And so in a way, every time you're starting to change some people's minds, it creates a climate in which other people may feel a little bit less fearful, and that can build on itself in a certain way and start to gather momentum. And so that's why I think this process of dialogue and discussion, not as a substitute for pressure, but in addition to pressure, can be part of bringing change.
Thank you. In fact, I want to follow up a little bit on this. So I noticed in the last year how the demonstrations went on campuses in the United States and worldwide. But I noticed that, because I was also helping with the SJP demonstrations here on campus, that there's two sets of demonstrations, the Jewish ones and the Palestinian ones, where they're both against the war, on the same page. And I kind of try to evaluate, is this a healthy situation? Or is that a moment we're not capturing for these two groups to start talking? And because, there are chants and slogans and even maybe beliefs on both sides that are affecting this commingling, that could dangerously lead to further separation. Like it could have been a moment that if it was moderated, again, the famous slogan, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. So both sides repeated it, and it was never clear if they first fully understood that their slogan is understood, like they're sure of it, and they have evaluated how it could have been misunderstood and how they're going to mitigate that, and how they empower each other in mitigating that in their respective communities. Do you think we missed an opportunity there?
Well, I think first of all, my sense was that there were moments, you could correct me, where there were moments where the Palestine Solidarity Movement was actually quite happy for Jews to go ahead and speak as Jews, right? Maybe because they felt the repression would be less severe, and so some of those early moments in protest were by Jewish Voice for Peace, and if not now, I remember when they took over the rotunda of the Capitol, did some big events in New York, and I think you need both. I think that the integration between the two movements is really, really crucially important, because this is a fight against supremacy, and it's a fight against ethno-nationalism, and so a movement against that has to manifest its opposition to ethno-nationalism by bringing together people of all different backgrounds, right? And so this is not a struggle of one tribe against another tribe. It's a struggle of a principle against the principle of tribal supremacy. But I also think there are moments where Jews come together to speak as Jews that have a particular power within a Jewish community. I mean, and I think that sometimes give people a sense of community that's valuable. So I imagine there are times where Palestinians want to be in their own spaces, speaking as Palestinians. I think that I thought that, to me, some of the most powerful moments for the encampments were where you had students together of all different backgrounds, and you had Jewish students praying next to Muslim students praying, everybody trying to protect one another, looking out for each other. I thought those were really, 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 really beautiful things to see. And I think that I'm not a scholar of social movement, but I think all social movements struggle with questions of strategy and questions of purism and questions of factional difficulty, right? So I think that, and how much do you want to cater to different audiences? Who are you trying to cater to? And I think these are difficult questions. I do think there were times where I think that the slogans, or at least the slogans that got the most attention, because the media coverage was often the media coverage would often pinpoint, right? If there were 20 slogans, media would focus on the one that was most incendiary. To me, the question of the thing about Palestine from the river to the sea, my sense is that it was perceived very differently by different communities. So University of Chicago did this poll, and they asked the question, does Palestine from the river to the sea mean the expulsion of Jews from Israel? And they found that 66% of Jewish college students said yes, but only 14% of Muslim college students said yes, right? So the term was meaning something very, very different. Now, I think one could argue that a term that is so easily misinterpreted, right, and willfully misinterpreted, may not be the best slogan, right? So if you said Palestinians will be free from the river to the sea, maybe in some ways you would make it, people will still try to, demonize you, but maybe you make it a little harder for them to demonize you, and that would be a wise thing to do, when I remember I had this conversation with Rashid Khalidi, the great Palestinian historian, and I asked him about the student movements, and particularly at Columbia's own campus, about some of the things they did. And I said, did they ask your advice about any of these things? And he said, of course they didn't ask my advice. I'm an old person. Young people in activist movements never ask the advice of old people of what to do. When I was a student activist, I never asked the old people either. So, such as it is,
That's been my experience, and it's struggle to try to even reach out to them and have them respond, to chase them down every time. And anyway, I do have one last question, and it's a depressing one. Should I ask it? Is there time?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, it's about the impending second Nakba. So we have growing evidence now that the Israeli and US administrations are working toward the mass displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, an outcome that, if realized, would amount to one of the largest acts of forced population transfer in modern history. For Palestinians, this is not just a political crisis, but an existential one. A second Nakba unfolding in real time, and yet the world watches often in silence. Given what we know about the trajectory of Zionism and its intersection with global power, how do you see this moment? And if forced displacement is the goal, what avenues remain for those who oppose it? Whether Palestinians or Jews, or the broader international community or activist community?
Thank you. I share your fears very deeply. I think that I think that whatever discourse there was in kind of Jewish-Israeli politics that was open to ending Israel's control over millions of Palestinians who lack basic rights in the West Bank and East Jerusalem is gone, right? There is nobody, when they had a vote in the Knesset last summer about two states, not a single member of a Jewish political party voted yes, right? So,
People complain.
oh, sorry. So, when people say Benjamin Netanyahu is the problem, right? Well, Yair Lapid didn't vote for that. Benny Gantz didn't vote for that. The Labor Party didn't vote for it, right? So there is no discourse, let alone a discourse that says we should have equal citizenship for everybody in this in the one state that exists from the river to the sea, right? So what was left? What was left was a management system, a system of managing people who lack basic rights. The most influential intellectual in Israel during the Naftali Bennett interregnum was this guy named Micha Goodman, right? And Micha Goodman wrote a book that was very popular in kind of centrist American Jewish circles called Catch 67, and it was exactly about that. It was that we're going to have to manage these people without giving them rights for a long time. Let's do it in a smarter way. But it doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. So the idea was you've got the Palestinian Authority there. They're helping you control the West Bank as a subcontractor. And then in this bizarre way, Israel developed this relationship with Hamas that Tarek Bakoni called the violent equilibrium, where you would fight back and forth, but basically Israel was relying on Hamas to keep things under control in Gaza. If Islamic Jihad was firing rockets, they would, through intermediaries, tell Hamas to get Islamic Jihad to knock it off. So they thought Hamas was playing almost a kind of version of a role the Palestinian Authority was playing, right? But it doesn't work. You can't manage a system of kind of indirect rule over millions of people who lack basic rights indefinitely when they have no prospect that they're going to have freedom, right? So the Palestinian Authority starts to erode, and Hamas, it turns out, was not interested in playing that game, right? They were pretending to play that game, but they were actually trying to do something else, right? And so on October 7th, the management system breaks down in this catastrophic, horrifying way. And what is left on the table, right? Because nobody in Israel is proposing to solve this political problem by addressing the root of the problem, which is people's lack of freedom. So if Israelis see we don't have a management system, right? We're not even willing. The Biden administration wanted to recreate a management system. They were like, bring the Palestinian Authority into Gaza, pretend we support a two-state solution, and try to put the genie back in the bottle. But Israeli politics has become too radicalized after October 7th, even for that. So the only people who had a coherent idea were the people on the Israeli right. And their idea was, Palestinians are going to resist, and if Palestinians resist, Palestinians have to be out of here. We have to get rid of them. And Bezalel Smotrich had written this in 2017 in his decisive plan, basically. Palestinians can only say if they accept that they will be subjugated, if they contest that, we're going to get rid of them. And this is in the political DNA of Zionism, right? This is deep within, almost all the major Zionist thinkers are talking about population transfer before Israel's created, and then it happens when Israel was created. There's another population transfer expulsion in 1967. So it's right there. And one of the things that I have learned, from the writing of people like Ta-Nehisi Coates is that in any political society, any country, if you don't face the past, it is right there like a loaded gun for you to use it again. There is nothing about the passage of time, new generations, new technologies that suggest it can't come right. That's what we're seeing with Donald Trump, right? In some ways, we're living the fact that we were not willing to face our own history, and now we're right back with our 21st century version of Andrew Jackson, right? So Israel is right back there again, and it has this impunity to do it, right? And so Israel, we know that from the reporting that after October 7th, when Israel began its assault on Gaza, Netanyahu asked the Biden administration to pressure the Egyptians to open the border, right? The fewer Palestinians there are, the less of a threat they pose, right? But the Egyptians wouldn't open. They recognized what a disaster this would be for Egypt. And the Biden administration doesn't seem to have pushed them very hard to do so. Now we're in a different environment, right, where Trump has said, this is my idea, right? And so what it does is it gives Israel an invitation to resume the war in Gaza, which I think is tragically very likely to happen, because I don't think Netanyahu can stay in power if the war ends. To resume it with a clearer focus on expulsion as the goal of the second round of the war, which would mean having to fight in even more barbaric and savage ways than Israel has before, if that's even possible. And as you know, again, better than me, versions of this are also happening in the West Bank, right? I mean, it's not happening, it's not like I think that the Israeli government thinks by 2027 we can get all the Palestinians out of the West Bank. But they think we just keep increasing the pressure, making things worse and worse and worse, meaning with less land, less freedom, less capacity to live, and basically, who knows? That over time, things will happen. This is kind of the way that they operate, and we don't have a force in the world right now that has the power to stop that. We don't have, the Arab states don't seem to have the capacity or willingness to do that. The Palestine Solidarity Movement is right now not strong enough, especially as liberal democracy declines, which weakens its power. China seems to have other things on its mind. Yeah, I worry about this a tremendous amount. I mean, I would like to think that it's just simply not possible to do in the 21st century what was done in the 19th century in places like the United States. But I think that sometimes I think that that's a kind of progressive view of history that is a little bit naive, right? It's only impossible if people make it impossible, right? And the question is, who is making it impossible? I think all of us have to do our part to try to make it impossible. But I don't know if we'll succeed.
Thank you.
Okay, about to turn it over to questions. Just wanted to make 2 quick points. I think this event is actually a good indication of a productive dialogue. I wondered, since it was such a Jewish conversation in your book, how many non-Jews would be interested. I've been particularly struck at the interest from the local Palestinian community. I mean, the very fact that the ADC endorsed brought it to my attention shows that there actually is a deep interest in kind of learning more about the Jewish experience. Just as you said, Peter, that's for a number of us Jews, we now, we didn't do this decades ago, but now we're a lot more interested in learning about the Palestinian experience. So that's a sign for hope. The second thing, I think we neglected to thank the San Diego World Affairs Council. I see Dave there. The San Diego World Affairs Council also helped promote this event. So thanks to the San Diego World Affairs Council. I apologize for not mentioning it sooner. So with that said, we'll go with questions. I guess I can go ahead and...
Yeah, I'll just see you over here.
Yes, okay. All right, I'll try to circulate.
Hello, thank you. First off, I have a question specifically on the protests. So what are your thoughts on the crackdown on protests in the US and within Europe, especially in European nation states, that closely tie their identity to protests, like France, or Paris, France in particular, where for the first time since its founding in 1872, the director of Sciences Po allowed the riot police to enter their St. Thomas campus and remove encampments and protesters. Building on that and to connect it with your work in particular, what role does the virtuous victim archetype, often employed by Israel, such as in the oral arguments made by Israel's attorney in the case brought by South Africa, shape the response from these governments?
Thanks. I think one of the things that we should have learned is that the kind of Palestine exception doesn't only remain the Palestine exception, right? It becomes a kind of it becomes a breach that then is widened and used for many other groups of people who also, other powerful forces in society that don't want criticism and dissent, right? So one of the things that happened when, the organized American Jewish community and Christian Zionist groups were going around getting all these state legislatures to pass laws basically saying, if you boycott the state of Israel, you can't have state employment with, you can't work for the state government or have a contract with the state government. So what happened, and my colleague Laura Friedman has really followed this really closely, and she is that once people saw that you could do this as a model, there were other groups like oil companies, fossil fuel companies. So this is a great idea. Let's also basically say that if you boycott fossil fuel companies, you can't work for state government, right? And so I think we see a version of this in the crackdown on pro-Palestinian speech and activism on campuses, right? Like you say, okay, now the rules of college protests are, you can't protest in front of the president's office, right? Because that'll distract someone in the library who's trying to doing their English homework, or it'll disrupt the meeting that's happening in the president's office. So you have to have it, 52 miles down the road, and you can only have it between 7:45 and 8:03, and you can only have between 23 and 29 people, and you have to pay, $10,000 as insurance or something like that, right? So, who's gonna find that really, really interesting? The people at the university who don't want the labor unions on campus to be protesting them for a higher contract. That's going to be also really useful for them, right? So this assault on the rights of people who care about Palestinian freedom is part and parcel of now this much broader effort to not just restrict free speech, but to destroy universities, right? I mean, I always thought that the language of universities as anti-Semitic was in some ways just a more polite way of saying that you think they're anti-white. And that, that there's reason to believe that the Elise Stefanik's of the world actually are not deeply concerned really about the fate of Jews, given that they're basically in league with white nationalists, but that they don't like the fact that universities are environments that are challenging America's founding myths, raising critical debates about the nature of American society. And so this becomes a way, by attacking them as anti-Semitic, to shut down, as a way of shutting down DEI, of shutting down any course that talks about colonialism, all of this kind of stuff, right? And so, I think it's extremely, extremely dangerous, and it's tremendously upsetting to me to see the way that organized American Jewish organizations are participating in, I think, the kind of destruction of the institutions that are critical for America's existence as a free liberal society, right? I mean, these universities have been some of the critical institutions in American Jewish family after American Jewish family. The way the families narrate their rise and their success in America is through the journey through these universities, right? To turn around and then basically be participating in destroying these universities, right? So that you can try to protect them from being vehicles for criticism of Israel, it seems to me is just a horrifying thing to watch.
Okay, what I'd like to do to have multiple questionnaires. Let's do 3 questions at a time.
Great.
Okay, so I'll start with Professor Guru.
Thank you. So an extension of the earlier question, when we look at American politics now, there's a big debate about whether we'll become a multiracial democracy. For the conservative right, there's a consistency because they don't want multiracial democracy in America and multiracial democracy in Israel.
Right.
But for liberal Democrats,
Right.
there is a contradiction.
Yes.
And what do you think about the future of this contradiction? Do you see that increasingly the supporters of Israel will become more right-wing Republicans in America, or you will see the other way of transformation? Thank you.
Okay, so don't answer it yet. Manal, you want to? Huh? Did you want to hand to someone outside?
You've mentioned the Jewish supremacy underlying the suppression of Palestinians, and you've mentioned the political DNA involved with this, and you've mentioned the importance of empathy. And this is difficult for me to express, but what really concerns me is what seems to be going on in the minds of Israeli Jews, at least in what is portrayed in the news. And I can just say as an example, when the 3 hostages who appeared emaciated were recently released, there was an outcry of rage and anger from the Israeli public. 3 people. And I thought, where was the outcry when we saw thousands of emaciated children? Now, I mean, is this because of the resistance against Israelis expressing these views, or it really disturbs me. What can you do to make me feel a little more at ease about this? Because I don't want to think this is simply a matter of a lack of humanity.
Okay, one more question, and then Peter can answer all 3.
Hi, so as somebody who's a very proud Zionist, I really look to find open conversation. Obviously, I came today to learn about different perspectives, but I found it really, really hard on this campus to have open conversations with people. I've asked multiple times to multiple students, multiple staff, and everybody always turns me down. I've offered to buy them coffee, offer lunch, everybody turns me down. What do you suggest I do?
I'm happy to have a conversation with you. As you know, I have offered it multiple times. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. And I also appreciate your efforts to go and learn and listen and talk to people who have different views. And I would really encourage you to continue doing that. And to keep doing it until you find people who are willing to have those conversations. And I think you will if you keep trying. But the other thing is, even if you can also do versions of that with books, right? In the sense that I think it's great for you to go and try to find people to talk to, right? But you can also start just by, I mean, even if they won't meet you, the books will definitely, you can get them out of the library, they're not going to resist, right? You don't have to offer to buy them lunch, right? Like, I would really encourage you, like, pick up Edward Said's classic, The Question of Palestine, right? And it's a book that really had an impact on me, partly because of how much empathy that he, I think, expresses for Jews and his ability to understand why Zionism was so compelling to so many Jews, even though he, as a Palestinian, describes in great detail how destructive it was for Palestinians. I think that book really helped me get inside the Palestinian experience. So there are so many opportunities for you to think and learn and be challenged by Palestinian experiences, even if you can't find the person right now who's willing to have that conversation, right? I think that, but I really admire you for having that intellectual curiosity and openness. I think it's exactly what college students should have. In terms of the question about, Israeli-Jewish reaction to Israeli suffering, Jewish suffering, and Palestinian suffering, I think this is not a Jewish story. I think that systems of political supremacy depend upon and enforce a dehumanization of people on the other side, right? And so when people are dehumanized, you don't respond to them in the same way when they suffer, right? You just kind of look away, right? Or you find ways of kind of justifying it and basically saying, well, they brought it upon themselves, right? And I think this is something you see across societies where this happens. So I think that this, unfortunately, is a kind of a dynamic that is and part of what my book tries to do actually is respond very explicitly to the arguments that I hear in my own community about why, which I think serve this function of allowing people to shut off. So, because I've had so many conversations with people in which go something along the lines of, well, have you seen that there are more reports of starvation in Gaza? There's reports that most of the hospitals and the schools and the universities and the buildings are destroyed. There's now record numbers of child amputees, and people say something like, well, Hamas is using these buildings as human shields, right? And what strikes me about this is that I rarely find that when people say that they've actually done much of an investigation into this question, right? Or what international law actually says about what your responsibilities are in attacking an area if there are fighters there, right? There actually are standards by international law. They don't allow you to blow up an apartment building or a hospital just because you think there are some enemy fighters there. If that were the standard, right, then Palestinians would also be justified in blowing up entire apartment buildings in Tel Aviv because an Israeli general lives there, right? That's not the standard by which international law operates, right? The Kiryat, Israel's defense headquarters, is located in downtown Tel Aviv, surrounded by schools and other civilian areas, right? It doesn't mean that you can blow up those schools because they're nearby. But I guess my point is that I don't really think these things really are arguments as much as they are kind of defense mechanisms that allow people to not have to take on board at a human level the suffering of other people. And I think, unfortunately, in Israel it's worse because the Israeli media, there's so little emphasis in the Israeli media on humanizing Palestinians, allowing Palestinians to speak for themselves, and on even just showing what's actually happening in Gaza. The media conversation in Israel is overwhelmingly about October 7th, about the hostages, and about the plight of Israeli soldiers. Not that those are not important subjects, but they're used to kind of to block out a conversation about what happens to Palestinians. On the question, your question, I think that the pro-Israel, organized pro-Israel community, I think, recognizes more and more that they are safer with Republicans in charge than with Democrats in charge. Because Republicans can be unconditionally support pro-Israel without having to defy their party base so much, right? Because there is still a lot of support for Israel in the Republican Party base. There's much less now in the Democratic Party base. So Democrats have to act against their wishes of their party base. Now they will still do so, right? Because it's not a voting issue for everybody. For most people, it's not necessarily the #1 voting issue. And also because you can intervene like AIPAC and Democratic Majority for Israel does in these party primaries. But it's a more, I think, you would be right, if you were AIPAC, you'd be right to worry that the next Democratic president will not be as pro-Israel as Joe Biden was. Whereas I think you could have more faith in the Republican Party, right? And so I think that's part of why you see this shift. Also just demographically, if you look at the demographic nature of pro-Israel activists in the United States, more of them in the younger generation are coming out of the Orthodox community, and Orthodox Jews are now voting overwhelmingly Republican. That's a largely Republican-facing community, and that's going to be the backbone of the pro-Israel community, right? So I think that if the Democratic Party can take power, right? I think it's imaginable that you could have a Democratic president who will take a different view vis-a-vis Israel. But that also requires that requires that America has elections that are free enough for that to happen, right? And we just really, a lot of this is really in question, right? I mean, probably the more authoritarian the American political system becomes, the safer American policy towards Israel is.
I have 5 questions on this side, and I see the hands here. I didn't forget you, okay, but there will be another round.
Actually more about the book than even asking questions. You know, the first impression I had when I saw the title of the book, it really, for me as a Palestinian, I felt that you were trying to express pain as a Jew because of what Israel is doing in the name of Judaism, basically. However, as I read the book, when I reached the chapter where you talk about the October 7th, I was taken aback. The reason I was taken aback because what you did is what you just said that you shouldn't be doing. You humanized the Jewish victims in October 7 by name, by event, by phone calls, you know, I mean, what happened exactly. However, I did not see any single thing about humanizing a Palestinian. You know, the one who really jumped into my head is Hind Rajab. It is very well documented. Has they killed her? It's recorded on in a tape. And it seems like, I bet you, if she was an Israeli Jewish girl, somebody would have bought the Hollywood rights for her story. But I didn't see any of that, or something like that. I know you did address the hospitals, the starvation, the wounded, the killed, but to me the personalization is when you name an Israeli victim, I really would like to see also you naming a Palestinian victim, so people can connect with the human being as a human being, not as a number only. 10,000 Palestinians got killed. Lastly, I was really surprised with this book, The New Anti-Semite, that was written in 1974. It was really a surprise to me, because I didn't think even it was an issue at that time for the ADL or the ADL staff. So my question, an idea came to my mind now. Maybe there should be a book now. I mean, we are at that stage where maybe it would be called something like the ADL is Anti-Defamation League. The ADL kosher, a new anti-Semites.
Oh, Yahweh.
Okay.
All right, real quick. So, just for our pal Zionists over here, real quick, I want to recommend the book, The Wall Between. It's co-authored between a Palestinian man and a Jewish man, and it gives the perspectives of both sides and going into triggering words, like how for a Palestinian, the word Zionist can be triggering, and really trying to understand how that impacts the other. And my recommendation for you is to ask yourself how genuine you are in trying to understand the other perspective, and if you are willing to have love for that other human being and for their humanity in this search. Otherwise, a lot of people might question your genuineness of trying to do this. And so my questions for you go to language, because I could tell that you're very thoughtful on the use of your language, and so this is just me trying to understand from your perspective. As an American Palestinian, father was born in 1934, and my mother born in 1954. So I have a very different perspective. A lot of Palestinians refer to Israel proper as Palestine, Palestine, or occupied Palestine. So first question, what are your thoughts? How does that make you feel when we use this language? Also, on the use of language of anti-Semitism and how it's been utilized by AZL and tangling it with the state of Israel, do you think it would be more useful or have more power to utilize the language of anti-Jewishness instead of anti-Semitism in the work that we're doing? That's it.
And just, so we're rotating between Manal and me of asking questions. I know we're not going to get to everyone, but Manal, you go to next.
Yes. Hi, thank you, Peter, for being here. I really appreciate listening to you talk. You're very eloquent. And I just wanted to say I'm not a Palestinian. I'm actually Bosnian. And as you know, because you seem very well versed on the history of Bosnia, we had our own genocide, and sort of the world left us hanging, and we were left basically to die and were butchered. In many ways, just like the Palestinians, we see a lot of parallels between Gaza and Srebrenica. And with everything you said, with the, considering what the Knesset has been doing over these past several years, since the beginning really, and the forced expulsion, doesn't it make sense for us to begin actually vocally supporting Hamas? That's, for me, they have the legal right to resist internationally under international law, and nobody else is defending the Palestinians, so I would say that Hamas is our only option at this point. What would you say on that?
Right. Okay, so why don't I start with that, and then I'll go back, and if I don't remember everything about your question, you can remind me. I deeply disagree with that perspective for a number of reasons. First of all, because I think for a liberation movement to be successful, but certainly to be moral, it has to maintain a belief in international law and the preciousness of civilian life. Right? I don't believe that all Palestinian, that it is realistic to expect a liberation movement to be purely nonviolent. The African National Congress was not purely nonviolent, but it did emphasize the distinction between attacks on military and industrial targets and attacks on civilian targets. And unfortunately, Hamas has not, even though I think I know actually from reporting that the ANC advised Hamas to stop suicide bombings, which were specifically aimed in the 1990s and then in the 2000s at civilian targets. And then Hamas continued to do that both in the 90s and in the 2000s. And then after October 7th, killed a very, very large number of civilians, which I think is a war crime. It's immoral, and I think it doesn't, and I think it corrodes the moral core of a liberation movement that is about freedom and human equality and the preciousness of all life. Plus, I don't believe in Islamism as a politics. It seems to me it's counter to liberal democracy. Liberal democracy, I don't believe in Jewish states, I don't believe in Christian states, I don't believe in Muslim states. I believe in states that treat people equally under the law, irrespective of their race, religion, sex. What exactly Hamas means by a Muslim state, as a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, I'm not an expert on that, but I'm not interested in finding out. And I think there are there have been many other Palestinian efforts at resistance that I think are much more ethical, right? That calls for boycotts and divestments and sanctions, efforts at the International Criminal Court, the Court of Justice, the Great March of Return. There are a whole series of other efforts. Now the tragedy is that those efforts have been met not with support, right? But they've met with, essentially they've been largely defeated, right? But I think the response to that is to try to redouble support for those kind of efforts, not to support attacks on civilians. Which I think, again, not only are immoral, but are counterproductive, because ultimately, you have to speak, you have to pressure Israeli Jews, but you also have to speak in a certain way to Israeli Jews. I think this is what the ANC understood about white South Africans. There was pressure, but there was also a vision of a place for them in a free society. And I think when you target civilians for slaughter, you can't communicate that message. On the question about the language, so I think the one question was about the term Palestine or occupied Palestine. I completely understand why Palestinians and other people would use that term to describe the area. The reason that I tend to use the term Palestine/Israel or Israel/Palestine is that I think at this point there are two groups of people that think of themselves as peoples in this territory, right? It may be true that in some future world, you could imagine Israeli Jews thinking of themselves as Palestinians, right? But we are nowhere near that world today. I think for the foreseeable future, Israeli Jews are going to think of themselves as Jews. And that's why when I say Israel-Palestine or Palestine-Israel, I'm thinking about this as a binational country, a country with two different peoples in which there should be complete legal equality, and in which there could be some respect for the cultures of those two peoples. And so you could have, Arabic and Hebrew as national languages. Now I can understand why some Palestinians, others might feel like this is unjust, this is blessing the fruits of a settler colonial enterprise, but putting aside the fact that I think Zionism was a settler colonial project, but was also a project of Jewish refuge for people who survived the Holocaust. I also think that the reality is this is where you are in 2024 in Israel and Palestine today, right? And I think to deny the existence of Israeli Jews as a people, I think is ultimately just not to face kind of reality. So anyway, that's why I use the term Israel and Palestine. So what was the other term you asked about? I'm sorry.
Instead of using anti-Semitism,
Oh.
using anti-Jewish.
Anti-Jewish would be a much better term than anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a really, really lousy term. It comes out of you probably know, it comes out of the kind of race science of Germany in the 19th century, in which Jews were considered to be a Semitic race, right? It's a terrible term, right? And I totally understand why many other people who have roots in the Middle East don't like the idea that anti-Semitism is a synonym for anti-Jewishness, right? When those people are Semitic themselves. I think, unfortunately, though, so I think using anti-Jewish is a better term, but I think it's unlikely that we're going to basically be able to replace anti-Semitism with anti-Jewishness, at least anytime soon. On the question of the book, I think that I don't think it's quite fair to say that there's no humanization of Palestinian suffering. If, for instance, it's true, the second chapter is about October 7th and the things that led up to October 7th, the context of October 7th. But the third chapter, which is about the destruction of Gaza, does have stories, particularly, my friend Mohammed Shahada's friend Ali, which goes into a lot of detail about what happened to him and his family as Gaza was being destroyed, and ultimately led to him being killed by Israel, and also him narrating how his own views were changing as his family was undergoing this unimaginable agony. And there are other stories of Palestinians particular stories of Palestinians from the Nakba, and then what particularly happened to them, talked about by name, and what happened to their families in 1948, and even stories of what happened in 1956, when you had people like Ziad al-Nakhleh, the now leader of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who saw his father being killed when he was 3 years old. So in terms of the Anti-Defamation League, I think that part of the problem with the Anti-Defamation League right now is that the media treats the Anti-Defamation League as the kind of the equivalent of the NAACP, and it really should not be treated as that, right? It should not be treated as, it's treated as a kind of mainstream civil rights organization, right? But that's not really the way it functions. It really functions primarily as an Israel advocacy organization, right? So the people in the media should not be taking its data, right, and viewing it as credible. Right? And so I hope that we'll get to a time where that's no longer the case.
Okay, so we have about, I'd say 10 minutes at most. This person's been waiting to ask a question for a while. I would ask, we'll try to get 3 more questions. I asked the questionnaires to try to make it short, and Peter Beinart respectfully for the short, to try to end by 5.
Yeah, my question, like you're talking about our new reality. Well, the realities in the 70s and 80s where Rabbi Kahana was walking around in the Hebrew University giving us money to leave. And now it's actually the Israeli government doing it. And Trump is repeating their mantra, and they have maps of all told Israel and how to go into it. So writing books is good. We're having a good discussion here. And then we all go home. The question is, this is Nazism. This is ethnic cleansing. This is crime against humanity. We need to rise to a point where, beyond writing books and having an intellectual discussion, we're in Holocaust, right? So what is it you're proposing for us to rise and scream against what's happening, besides writing books and having intellectual discussions?
Okay. I have a 2-part question, of course. First is, I don't understand what you mean by cultural Zionism. I'm a Jew. When I hear Zionism, I think of the supremacy of Israel, or the policies that support that. Cultural Zionism includes, to me, just using the word Zionism, a kind of superiority. So I don't understand your use of that term. And secondly, I'm interested in what your view is of the boycott divestment movement.
Do we have one last question?
There's actually, I am monitoring the age of the
That was your last one.
Very short. Please tell us about the danger and the role of Christian Zionists in the conflict that is going on now. And would you consider them opportunistic because all they are after is to get to the second coming and then they want to kill the Jews?
How about all religious zealots?
Great. So, I mean, on your question, look, I'm a writer. That's what I do. I feel, in many ways, like that's very inadequate to this moment. But writing is my best effort to shape people's opinions and rouse people in whatever limited way I can to get them to act, right? And so the form that action could take, there are political organizers who are better at figuring that out than I am in terms of what the most effective kind of political action at this moment is. But I agree, especially now that Donald Trump has been elected, it's very, very frightening to think that even the most effective political tactics seem really not commensurate to the speed of the catastrophe that's happening right now. I mean, I think that, sometimes I imagine a situation in which Benjamin Netanyahu's flying somewhere and has mechanical problems and his plane has to land somewhere and he gets arrested and he has to go in front of the International Criminal Court. I mean, I do think that one of the things that is really, one of the things that's most striking to me and most depressing is that Israel's ability to now contemplate waging another round of war in Gaza that would be even more destructive, even more genocidal, it shows how little the limit, how weak these international institutions, the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice are, right? Because it just shows that these people are not, they're not afraid at all, right, of people facing a consequence. I really do think that if Israeli political leaders and generals and even lower level soldiers, if they felt that their actions were going to mean that they couldn't safely travel to Europe, for instance, because they might actually be arrested, or that their companies could not work vis-a-vis Europe because Europe is a critical economic partner for Israel, that would actually really, that would change the way Israelis thought about how to respond. But we're just not, even despite the work of South Africa, which I think has been remarkable, and the work of these institutions, we're not there. And I think part of that is because we're in this terrible moment of an assault on liberal democracy around the world, which means that these very weak and fragile norms are being attacked by the most powerful country in the international system, which is our country.
3 minutes for the last 2 questions.
Yeah. Okay. Cultural Zionism, so we think of Zionism and Jewish hatred as synonymous, right? But in fact, probably the second most influential Zionist thinker, the late 19th, Achad Ha'am, Herzl's kind of intellectual antagonist, opposed the idea of a Jewish state, right? What he believed in was a kind of thriving Jewish culture in historic Palestine, or what they would call the land of Israel, right? And so then you have people in the 1930s and 40s like Martin Buber, who called themselves cultural Zionists, who explicitly opposed the creation of a Jewish state. Buber actually testifies against, in the UN Commission, he testifies against partition and against the creation of a Jewish state, and he supports a binational state. So that's the tradition that I'm talking about when I talk about cultural Zionism. It's true. It is not the Zionism that has existed since 1948, right? Which is the Zionism of Jewish supremacy, right? But there was another tradition, and the reason I think it's worth remembering that is that it allows us to separate the question of Jewish statehood from the question of whether you can have a Hebrew-speaking population living in this area, right? Which is what the cultural Zionists believed in. No, sorry. I think I've only got 3 minutes. So, what was the other part of your question?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I support nonviolent forms of pressure. And I think that boycott, divestment, sanction is one of those. Now, BDS focuses a series of lots of different campaigns, right, on different areas. And so I think that one can choose about which of those campaigns one wants to be involved in. But I think, in general, I'm sympathetic to the notion of nonviolent pressure. It doesn't mean I carry a card which says BDS, which means every particular BDS action I support. There are some anti-normalization efforts, for instance, that I actually don't support and I think are counterproductive, but I generally am sympathetic to the idea of nonviolent economic pressure. And what's the third?
Christian Zionism?
The 3, and do we have time?
No, we don't have any more.
Christian Zionism. I'm not an expert on Christian Zionism. But I guess my untutored opinion is that I don't think it's only about religion. I also think it's about a view of race, which is that there's a tremendous amount of anti-Muslim sentiment on the kind of white Christian right, and a sense of a kind of clash of civilizations, right? It's just that the Christian civilization has now kind of been redefined in some ways like a Judeo-Christian civilization. And so, and I think there's also a very deep affinity for Israel, which is not only about Christianity, but it's about America as a settler colony, and an identification with Israel as a country that has the same founding myths as America, as a kind of a promised land forged on a hostile frontier. So I think it's not sympathetic that the Americans who most want to celebrate uncritically the conquest of North America, right, are also the people who are most open to Israel, expelling and destroying the Palestinian population. So I think Armageddon plays obviously a role, but I don't think it's the only way of explaining what's happening on the American right.
All right, so we could certainly carry on this conversation until midnight into the next week, but unfortunately, we do have to clear out of this room by 9 o'clock. So, because I know people are going to come up to Peter afterwards, I do think we have to close it now. I thank you all for this spirited, productive dialogue. Of course, thanks, Peter.